Okay, thanks. So thanks everyone. As Zach said, my name is Thomas Sigler, and it's 11 o'clock here in Queensland. So I may be a little bit loopy, and I apologize in advance if I don't stick around for the 2 a.m. presentations. So my presentation's on applying spatial relatedness to understand co-ethnic patterns. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, I'll first talk about ethnic diversity in Australia and some of the more recent patterns. I'll then introduce the concept of spatial relatedness. And finally, I'll jump to what I actually did in this research. And I should probably acknowledge Renee Ehringer, who's my co-author. She's an excellent honor student of mine who may or may not be joining us. She's currently doing her master's at the ANU in Canberra. And I'd also like to shout out to the two Czech colleagues who inspired this, who I'll mention in a second, who I've just invited to join us as well. So Australia is a pretty diverse place. Approximately 50% of the country's population was either born outside the country or their parents were. So the exact statistic is 49%, and about 25% of Australians were born outside the country. So that means our cities are quite diverse. Most of those migrants live in cities. The composition of that's changed over time. So originally that was mainly people from the British Isles in Northern Europe. You can see the 1901 census indicates that quite a few people came from Ireland and Scandinavia and the United Kingdom. And although people still come from the United Kingdom, Australia also receives quite a few migrants from Asia, and most of the countries on the top 10 list, with the exception of the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Italy, which is a really aging Italian population, are actually from Asia. And it's not just the composition; it's actually the diversity and the spatial, so both the spatial diversity and the global geographical diversity of these immigrants. So you now have migrants from literally hundreds of countries, and making quite an impact in not just Sydney and Melbourne, but also in places like Brisbane, where I live, and Perth, to a lesser extent in Canberra and Darwin and Hobart. Here's a map of Sydney. I really like this one. So this is showing country of birth when you take away the United Kingdom. So United Kingdom tends to be number one in most suburbs for non-Australian born, but when you remove that, you can see quite a bit of diversity and quite a few patterns. You can see that, for example, there are quite a few South Africans and Chinese and Lebanese and Vietnamese and Italians, and that there's particular spatial patterns to where those groups live for one reason or another, which I don't really have time to get into, but you know, we think of sort of this concept of an enclave geography as characterizing our largest cities. So moving on to what spatial relatedness is, I really wanted to talk about where I stumbled across this. So my normal work is on economic networks. So this is my regular work that I work on using data from corporate subsidiaries and firms. And I was looking through some papers on different ways to measure network communities and understand pairwise relationships, and I came across this paper. So this is a paper by Yuri Hassman and Josef Novotny. Hi guys, if you're joining us. And I thought it was a really innovative way to look at the relationships between nodes across space. So we're really looking here at what's called spatial relatedness. So spatial relatedness is a measure that's showing us the degree to which different countries and the different groupings of people from different countries are related to one another based on the residential patterns. So if you look, for example, you can see that England and the Netherlands are quite close to Australia. So the idea there is that people from those countries overwhelmingly tend to live in the same suburbs. You can also see that, for example, Zambia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe are quite close to one another. And what that's saying is that people from those countries would also tend to live in the same suburbs, which entirely makes sense. There are a lot of cultural similarities, a lot of regional similarities. In some cases, you can see linguistic similarities, for example, between Latin Americans and people from Spain. You can see religious similarities between people from Islamic nations. You can often see race-based groupings where people may not come from the same part of the world, but in fact share a race or ethnicity for some other reason and tend to live near one another. So what is spatial relatedness? I haven't quite defined it yet. So it's the tendency of two groups to be spatially overrepresented in one or more spatial areas. And it's basically a pairwise measure. So it measures the joint concentration of two particular groups. In this case, we've defined that by country of birth. So for example, what's the spatial concentration of people from New Zealand and Australia, or Hungary and Czech Republic? But you could use the spatial relatedness to look at different kinds of relationships across different kinds of nodal actors. It's not a terribly widely used measure spatial relatedness. So I have found some papers from ecology and biology, which makes a lot of sense. You might want to know, for example, where two bird species co-locate and which species of birds or mammals or whatever might co-locate. And you also tend to find some work in social sciences, mainly in sociology, mainly in sort of ethnic studies, but not a whole lot of work. So I think this is a pretty innovative space, and I think it's got some real potential to innovate upon what we know about clustering. But it tends to also correlate to other measures of relatedness. So for example, as I mentioned, a lot of people would have different commonalities aside from where they live. They would be bound together by a common race or ethnicity, language, religion, or some other sort of affiliation. As I'll show you, there's one network, a sub-network community that I like to call the cricket network. So for example, people from New Zealand and people from Pakistan or people from the former, the British Commonwealth may congregate in the same suburbs. And, part of this comes down to the fact that they often enjoy the same sports. So there are a variety of reasons why people might co-locate, but we can explore those later. So here's the basic idea. These are very simple choropleth maps just to basically show you how I calculated this. And on the top left, you can see Vietnamese born. On the top right, you can see Australian born. On the bottom, you can see Chinese born. And this is just aggregate numbers. So very clearly, there are more Australians in Australia than there are Vietnamese. You can see that there's one tiny little suburb at the bottom that has a concentration of Vietnamese born and a couple central suburbs that have overrepresentation or some Chinese born. Now, if we split that into quintiles, right, we can see that a little bit more nuanced patterns emerge. So for example, you can see that China-born residents are overrepresented on the west side, Vietnamese-born residents are overrepresented on the south side, and Australian-born residents are represented everywhere but the center of the city. So Australians overwhelmingly suburban, those who are Australian-born, and those who are born in China or Vietnam, slightly more centrally located and slightly skewed towards the west side in the case of Chinese, which makes sense because that's where the universities are, and the south side in the case of Vietnamese. Now we changed those quintiles into the difference between actual versus anticipated numbers. So what we did is we did some matrix multiplication to figure out, based on the absolute number of Vietnamese and the absolute number of people in that suburb, what we would anticipate to find. And you can see that Chinese-born residents are overrepresented in the city center. You can see that Vietnamese-born residents are overrepresented in the south side, and you can see that Australian-born residents are overrepresented everywhere but the center. Then we binarized it, and this is a really key facet because the only real way you can get spatial relatedness is if you binarize your variables. So you basically take a quotient, and if it's above 1, it's a 1. If it's below 1, it's a 0. And if you have two 1s, you've got a spatial relation. So as you can see, you've got Vietnamese-born residents overrepresented in some suburbs, etc. And then when you overlap them, this is what spatial relatedness is. So you can see that there's spatial relatedness in inner city suburbs between Chinese and Vietnamese born. There's one suburb or two suburbs where there's spatial relatedness between Vietnamese and Australian born, and there are literally 0 suburbs where there is spatial relatedness in Brisbane between Australian and Chinese born. I actually thought this was a mistake. I actually had to double check it because I didn't think it was right, and it was. So it's incredible actually how segregated the two groups are, sort of a innocent byproduct of the actual analysis. So why do we use spatial analysis? What does it add to what we know about ethnic clustering and segregation? So we can't just play this categorical game where we lump people into these sort of natural categories, so to speak. So saying that there's a Chinese neighborhood or a Korean neighborhood isn't that useful. It's not useful for a number of reasons. One, a lot of nationalities arrived in different waves. So, for example, the Chinese migrants in Australia have been a long-standing feature in the Australian migration patterns, but they also came from different parts of China. They came in different social classes. The more recent Chinese migrants to Australia tend to be students. A lot of Chinese migrants who came in the 80s and 90s tended to be either refugees or labor migrants, and so on. So there's a lot of differentiation within groups, and there's also a lot of differentiation between groups. It addresses this issue of groupism, and it also addresses the issue of methodological nationalism. So we're not just looking at countries in isolation, we're actually looking at countries, groupings of countries, and not just the way we preconceive them, but the way they actually emerge from the data. I find that social network analysis is a really good way to look at this because it's effectively unbundling the issue, and the boundaries between these groups are slippery. So they might actually have cultural commonalities and things like that that may otherwise go unnoticed. And that this does translate to a real world geography. So despite the fact that it is sort of a network relation, it does translate to a real world relation. So here's what that looks like. Enough of the boring stuff. I'll get to the graphics and maps. So this is a theoretical map of what suburbs would look like with overrepresentation. And then this is how we turn it into a network graph. So the exact steps are the following. So these are 3 suburbs. You can see the Asian enclave. These are very hypothetical, but they do mirror to some degree the ethnic geographies of Australia. So you have an ethnic enclave with some number of Vietnamese and Chinese and Malaysians. You have a multi-ethnic inner city with some Slovakians and Kiwis and Indians, and then you have an Anglo Beach suburb, very characteristic population of somewhere like Bondi or Manly and Sydney, where you have large numbers of people from Germany and New Zealand and Australia. Then we translate that into relative numbers. So for example, if you look at the Asian enclave, you can see that in relative terms, there are not so many Australians. In relative terms, relative to the population of overall Malaysians or Vietnamese, there are large numbers of them. See, I'm getting buzzed. I'm assuming that means I have 10 minutes. Great. All right, so then we change that to binary, so you can see some of those ethnicities, or some of those nationalities, I should say, drop off. So for example, in the ethnic enclave, you can see that Australia drops off because it's not proportionately overrepresented. Australia is proportionally overrepresented in suburb B and suburb C, whereas, for example, New Zealand is not overrepresented in suburb C. So we lose a few ethnicities in binarizing it, and we just get the ones that are overrepresented. That binarization then turns into a network graph, which then can be treated like a network graph, and we can run things like modularity, etc. And then that again takes the shape of a real geography. And I think the innovation here is that we put that network, those network communities back into real life geography to see what those communities look like when actually spatially mapped out. All right, so finally, what does that look like in Australian cities? We've got about 7 minutes here. This is actually from Hassman and Novotny's work. So they found on the right, so they did some work on Australian, this is not on Australian cities per se, this is just Australia, if I understood correctly. So they found that, for example, Malaysians and Singaporeans were very likely to be spatially related. People born in Hong Kong and Korea, there's different reasons why different nations would be spatially related. For example, Cyprus and Greece, I think pretty obvious, they're both in the same part of the world, they both speak Greek. But an interesting one here is Iran and Malaysia. So Iran and Malaysia have almost nothing in common with one another other than the fact that they're both Islamic countries. But the reason they're spatially related is that a lot of Iranians and a lot of Malaysians tend to come as students. So those would be strong clusters around major Australian universities and in inner city areas and so on. So these are what our network graphs look like. You can see most of them have 3 communities. Perth and Brisbane have 4 communities. And that the communities are sort of largely characterized by what I would call the cricket group, as I mentioned. So that would be sort of Zimbabwe, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. It's the former Commonwealth, plus a few bits and pieces, and depending on the city of countries that are spatially related to them. You then have, generally speaking, have a large community comprised of Asian countries, with China as the strongest and most central node. Oftentimes those are areas, as I mentioned, with lots of students, as we have lots of international students, but not exclusively. And in fact, it's interesting to look at the Asian countries that don't send a lot of students to Australia, like Vietnam, often don't fall in those categories. So if you look at Melbourne, for example, you can see that China, Iran, Indonesia, and Korea all fall in one community, but in fact, Vietnam and Sri Lanka fall outside that community because the Sri Lankan and Vietnamese immigrants overwhelmingly do not tend to be students. Then we looked at the largest pairwise relationships and the weakest pairwise relationships, and often you find that the strongest pairwise relationships are between those who culturally are most similar to Australians, you might say, and the weakest relationships often tend to be those who have recently immigrated to Australia. Oftentimes those are on humanitarian visas, so Iraq is the one that stands out. So we only took the top 35, and Iraq is probably proportionately the smallest number. But most Iraqis have arrived in the last 10 years, and most have arrived on humanitarian visas, meaning they probably wouldn't have come with a lot of money in their pockets, and they also probably wouldn't have come as students or highly paid professionals living in the inner city. So Iraqis tend to live in the outer suburbs, and they're very weakly spatially related to the Australian populations or other populations as well. I don't think we quite have time to go over these, but you sort of get the gist of what I'm trying to say. A lot of the strongest spatial relations are between the Australian groups and other either European or former British Commonwealth groups. So then I'll break it down by individual city. So you've got Brisbane here. You can see change over time. We did 3 census periods, so 2006, 11, and 16. Someone's asking some questions. I think we'll answer those at the end if you don't mind. So you've got 6, 11, and 16. This is all from the census, by the way. This is all just downloaded directly from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And you can see Brisbane has gotten more diverse over time, and that's what that ethnic space looks like. So this is, I think, where we're trying to go with the innovation here. We're trying to turn network space into real space. And so we've projected those network communities onto real space. This is 2006, 2011, 2016. And you can see the strongest concentrations respectively between each of the 35 groupings. So for example, where it says POL-IRL, that means the Polish population in Brisbane in 2016 was most strongly spatially related with the Irish population in that particular suburb. So this is a map showing where the relationship was the strongest. Then you've got Melbourne, which is considerably more diverse than Brisbane, but at the same time, the geography is a bit simpler. You've got wealthy eastern suburbs with large numbers of people from East Asia. You've got middle-class northern and western suburbs with very diverse populations. And then you've got southeastern suburbs with very diverse populations. And this big ring of blue is mostly Australian-born in the outer suburbs. 3 minutes left. Great. All right. So just moving forward, you can see that's Melbourne. There's Perth, which is probably a little bit less interesting. No offense if you're from Perth. And then Sydney, which is probably the most interesting because it's the largest city. But you have, again, these 3 communities that very clearly emerge. You've got this sort of Anglo ring on the end. You've got sort of what I would call multi-ethnic Sydney in purple. And then you could call it Asian Sydney in green, as it's primarily a spatial relation between China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, a lot of whom are students, but a lot of whom are not students as well, depending on the area you are looking at. Right, so what are the findings, just to wrap it up here? Ethnic space is complex. So the idea of a Chinatown or a Little Italy is a little more than a discursive artifact of the past. As we know, settlement patterns aren't that simple. Groups arrived in waves. Oftentimes, they may not be from the same country, but they may share a common culture, or vice versa. They may be from the same country, but maybe 2 completely different cultures, if it's a very polarized population coming from the same country. So we're in a way, we're escaping that methodological nationalism, although ironically I have used nation of birth as the primary variable. Second, oftentimes you hear of a divided Sydney, this east-west Sydney, or this east-west divided Melbourne. A little bit less so in Brisbane with the north-south divide, but in fact, there's a lot of ways to slice it. You could say that there are really three phases or 3 network communities of ethnic space in Sydney, 4 or 5. I mean, depending on how you slice the modularity value, ethnic space becomes a lot more complex, and I think a lot more interesting than just saying we have this city that's divided along east-west lines. And finally, I think spatial relatedness really complements isolation and dissimilarity. So for those of you who are not researchers in this space, isolation and dissimilarity are very commonly used metrics. They're used in almost all urban geography and sociology studies to study the degree to which groups are isolated or paired with one another. And I think spatial relatedness does have some potential to complement that, particularly as we can use those network metrics to create network communities using the modularity function to better understand the relationship between groups. And that is all. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Thomas. It looks like we have time for maybe one quick question, and then if you can stick around, maybe we